We're here. All right.
Hello, Andy. Can you hear me?
Hello, Mr. Maguire.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay.
David.
We are welcome also, brother fan of PTRIS, which is the Supreme Governor of Europe, AHEPA Supreme Governor of Europe. Let's introduce that Supreme Governor of Europe is responsible for districts of Cyprus, Greece, and entire Europe. So welcome, brother PTRIS.
Thank you very much.
Now, Ms. Speckhard has a technical issue. We're trying to solve this problem.
Testing, testing. 1, 2, 3.
Andrea, kalispera.
Kalispera.
Good evening to everybody.
Good evening.
Good evening to everybody.
Good evening.
God bless you. This is Mark Yakovos.
All right. As I can see, Ms. Speckhard is here, right?
Yes, I am. Hello.
Oh,
We're ready to begin with only 2 minutes of delay. Thank you very much, everybody. Welcome. Thank you very much. I'm Andreas Apinidis. I'm the president of the chapter HG41 in Kalamaria, Thessaloniki. And thank you very much, everybody, that you are here, and your honor are this first international eforum. You all know that the moderator for today will be Mr. John Papageorgiou, and he will do the next introduce for the rest of the speakers. I will pass the floor now to Mr. And brother Panos Pitiris, which he will please, brother Panos Pitiris, a short greeting for our speakers and our panelists.
I would like to thank you all for participating at this panel today. It seems to be very high-level panel. Bring you greetings from our Supreme Lodge in the United States. And AHEPA is a global organization, and one of the pillars on which it's founded on is things like this: educating people, letting people know what's going on. So I'm really glad to see all of you here today, and I wish you a successful two-day conference, Andreas, and everybody else. Thank you very much.
Brother Panos, and I will pass the floor now to Brother Kostas Varsamis, who is, as I said, the Vice Governor of AHEPA Hellas. Hello, Brother Varsamis. Can you hear me? Brother Varsamis, can you hear me?
Maybe later.
I think that you can hear me now. So we are expecting also, first of all, you have the greetings. We have greetings from our governor, Brother Efstathos Kefalidis, who is with the Region 10 of Europe, and AHEPA Hellas, our patronates this great event. And we have everybody, we have a warm welcome from Mr. Again, Brother Efstathos Kefalidis, and we're expecting also Supreme President of AHEPA, Brother George Horiates, who has he sent already greetings, warm greetings for speakers and all the participants, and we're expecting him. Please, the host, Brother Kostas, if you see that Supreme President is here, please inform me to just inform the moderator, please. Okay, please inform the moderator. Before I will pass the floor to the moderator, allow me to introduce introduce him. Mr. John Papageorgiou. Mr. John Papageorgiou is our moderator for today, journalist, European Union Affairs reporter, Athens Digest, Athens Municipality Radio. He's a reporter with over 20 years of experience in the media sector. Since 2012, he has been covering stories related to the Greek financial crisis and the role of the international institutions in it. He has been hosting his own radio show for several radio stations in Greece since 1992. He currently hosts a morning show for the Municipality Radio of Athens. He is also the founder and head of Athens Digest, a daily newsletter written exclusively in English, and which provides a comprehensive coverage of the latest news from Greece. In parallel, he is a contributor of Oxford Analytica. John is a corporate communication and public affairs expert. He has delivered such services for high-level multinational and Greek companies and agencies. He has earned his bachelor's and master's degrees in chemistry from University of Athens. He also holds a private college diploma in journalism and radio production. Mr. Papageorgiou, the floor is yours. Thank you very much.
I do thank you very much for your kind introduction and your kind invitation. It's an honor being with you and moderating such a prestigious panel. We are, I mean, the people from Greece, we are coming from a small European country which actually surprisingly did well during the first wave, let's say, facing the first wave of COVID-19. And the question was if this is enough. The answer is that it's not. It's not because, first of all,
Papageorgiou, excuse me. Really, excuse me. Supreme President is here with us, George Horiates from United States, and he's here with us. Supreme President, welcome. Please, a short greeting for our friends and from our participants. Let's Mr. Hygun from Turkey, Mr. Howard from United States, now currently in Canada. Our moderator, Mr. Papageorgiou from Greece. Mr. Vlad Lupan from origin from Moldova, but currently in the United States. Ms. Speckhard, she's from United States also, and the pass is yours, Brother Horiates, to greeting to our friends and panelists and participants. Thank you very much that you are here.
Thank you, and to all the esteemed panelists and the participants. I want to thank you. Excuse my tardiness. I know, John, you were about to continue on. I am in the virtual world, much like the rest of you. We thought we had seen it all, but this historic pandemic has been unlike anything we've ever seen. So with that being said, in our society, I have been Zooming all throughout the world today, as I've been from Washington to the Carolinas, to Toronto, to Manitoba, to you, and then after I give this greeting, I have to go back to DC on some issues that we have. So it is almost incomprehensible, isn't it, that we've seen a society with the loss of lives, millions of people unemployed, and many small businesses struggling for relief. And yet here we are with this wonderful presentation and program, this eforum that you have with these distinguished panelists to give us their wisdom and with regards to our current state of affairs. But I take the time to acknowledge the lives lost and revered during this time. It's personal for many of us. I think we would be remiss if we didn't say that about our medical personnel, our first responders, and essential employees. They are helping people they don't even know, irrespective of nationality, irrespective of what part of the world you are in. To a large extent, this pandemic has brought us closer, even if it's via courtesy of Zoom and other applications. So I can tell you that our international response together has been tremendous, truly remarkable. However, the Hellenic ideals continue with regards to defending Hellenism, we will say. So AHEPA continues to be vigilant on all of those type of issues, and I congratulate you on this open forum with regards to those type of continued communications with regards to these very pertinent issues, the issues of today, whether they be on the border, whether they be not on the border, in other regards. We had a letter to the editor of the New York Times rebuking its slanted piece on the border crisis that led to an omission by the author of omitted facts, opening up of border funds, alliances in the northern Aegean. So in many regards, the hotbed is the border between Turkey and Greece. And I am hopeful that we can continue to have cooler heads prevail in this regard. But I appreciate your dedication, not only to the prevention of the spread of COVID-19, as we will again meet and have these type of open forums in person, but also to the principles of defending Hellenism. That is the inescapable conclusion of what you are doing here today. In your discussions in this changing global landscape, the history of AHEPA mandates and the history of Hellenism as we continue on to what is a new year meaning the celebration of the bicentennial of Greece itself this upcoming year. We have to continue to be vigilant on these issues, and these type of continued communications only lead to assist in what is a greater understanding between not just the academic types, but for all of us. So Greece and Cyprus are, in many regards, the new eastern front of Western civilization. And I'm hopeful that we all understand that, and we continue in that vein to a greater understanding of our communities worldwide. So it's truly remarkable to be here with you, and to, again, my apologies in coming in and giving merely a small presidential speech from AHEPA. But I can tell you this, the work that you're doing, Andreas, and bringing all of these people together is not only acknowledged, it's most and sincerely appreciated.
For our friends and our panelists and participants, thank you very much, Supreme President. Thank you very much. Brother Kostas Valsamis has an issue with his microphone, so he told me to share with you his warm welcome. And again, thank you, Supreme President, that you have that. I know your time is very tight, and your schedule is very tight there. You have a lot of meetings, you have a lot of jobs, you travel a lot, I know that you travel around the United States during this pandemic. It's heroic that you are doing now there. And everybody allow me to pass the floor again to Mr. Papageorgiou. And Mr. Papageorgiou, let's start this first phase of the forum. Thank you very much, and allow me to speak again to the end of the forum. The floor is yours. All right, thank you very much.
Once more, thank you. I take the opportunity, as Mr. Horiates just referred to, the change of the global landscape, and this is what we were referring also, because coronavirus is a global challenge. So globalization was questioned even before COVID-19, but it has more or less focused on the trade, let's say, or the SMEs and the business. Now the battle is much broader. We are referring to production of goods, supply chain, tourism, energy, trade, businesses, SMEs, and not only, cybersecurity, and of course health. And it's fresh news that the United States cut ties with the WHO, so this is more or less relevant. So the question is where we are heading to. And actually, who are we? Because there is not a common approach by everyone. And as Facebook says, this relationship between us is complicated. So having said that, I would like to introduce our 5 distinguished speakers, and I'm going to do that according to the order of their opening remarks. Mr. Joe Howard, he consults and lectures in international law and has a broad experience. He has consulted to the UN, to the private sector, government, academia, served with the Canadian Army on UN and NATO peace operations in Africa, Asia, Canada, and Europe. It's great having him with us. Of course, Mr. Emmanuel Goffi, he's a director of the Observatory on Ethics and Artificial Intelligence. That's, I think, very hot topic, artificial intelligence, of the Institute of Sapiens in Paris, and he is an expert in ethics, lecturing on this. Mrs. Anne Speckhard, the director of the International Center for the Study of Violent Extremism. Actually, I was just reading that she has interviewed over 700 terrorists and their family members, and she has a great experience in Western Europe, the Balkans, Central Asia, former Soviet Union, the Middle East as well. So thank you for being with us. It's an honor. Of course, an honor is having Mr. Vlad Lupan with us, an independent expert and researcher, a diplomat for over 23 years of experience in diplomatic and civil society experiences, and participating in 3 peacekeeping on development field operations. And actually, this will be very useful considering our topic. And finally, Mr. Hasa, Hygun, expert in politics, advisor to NATO, with a diplomat with a great expertise, which is an honor having him also here. I think you are based in Canada.
No, in the US.
In the US, sorry, Mr. Hygun. So I would like not to take your time and pass the floor to Mr. Howard for his opening remarks.
Thank you, sir. First order of business is to thank Andreas and his esteemed colleagues from the American Hellenic Education Progressive Association for pulling this off. Well done. A lot of effort, having done it myself. Congratulations. And it's obvious that I'm very humbled to be in the company of such eminent panelists and the moderator. With that out of the way, I hope, Mr. Moderator, I can take no more than my 5 minutes. That's my target to present my opening comment. And Andreas has assigned me the fields of business and social, but I have taken the liberty of expanding that to include one more field, and that is the field of international law. I think it cuts across not only social and business, but a lot of other fields. And if I can introduce that here, it may help shape the ground for subsequent panelists. I'm going to offer in my opening comment a diagnostic analysis, and I have 5 steps. I would like to define the current crisis, but in abstract terms. I'd like to analyze the context of the international order that surrounds that crisis. I'd like to review just a few fact patterns so that we don't get tied up purely in the abstract. And then I'd like to offer a proposition that perhaps we can consider in the back of our minds throughout the rest of the forum. And then I'll close out with offering some options for policy and international treaty law. No point identifying a problem if you can't come up with a couple of solutions. With that in mind, is everybody still able to hear me? Some have told me that my mic is dodgy, but if no one is putting their thumbs down, I'll charge ahead. Thank you. So I can't define a transnational crisis. Definitions are dodgy propositions, but we might be able to describe it. And so I have got just a few ideas on what in abstract terms, what constitutes a transnational crisis such as COVID-19. First of all, it's a national crisis that extends beyond the resources of a sovereign to fully contain it. And if we think back to the events in China, notwithstanding the rebuttals that will come, it was arguably a national crisis that was not entirely contained by the sovereign resources of China. On the other hand, secondly, it rises to the gravity of a material transnational crisis, same issue, but far larger scale. So we're looking at a resource management issue, we're looking at a scale issue. But beyond just the pure pandemic, there are multiplier effects. For example, there has been and there will continue to be real decreases in real gross domestic product, particularly among those non-G20 countries who are on the periphery of economic development. It is going to the transnational crisis will redirect capital flows, both within a country and beyond its borders. And this will have a follow-on impact in technology, in jobs and technology, natural resources, real estate, transportation. And if there's an impact on jobs, there's an impact on education. Thirdly, these kinds of crises aggravate the disequilibrium in international economic development. We don't know yet how this will impact the rate of development in developing countries. It will disrupt the natural expectation of international peace and security. I expect Vlad will have more to say than that. And lastly, it may enable global terrorism, which I understand we have another expert who will be able to speak to that. So to sum up, it sensitizes the understanding of other transnational crises, and it challenges the perception of what do we really understand to be a sovereign power. So with the crisis out of the way, let's look very briefly at the context. The executive event is always important, the crisis, but the surrounding context is equally important. And that is, do secondary sources and do primary sources, do they remain at the national level, or do they rise up to transnational and, more importantly, international organizational levels? How effective are the international treaty regimes? Each treaty regime has got an object and purpose that's defined by a member state, but it's contextualized by the transnational crisis, and it's enforced through international treaty obligations. Yet, it can be renounced by member states, as we have seen with the United States. More text to follow. And lastly, we're faced with the question, the existential question of international law: how relevant is it in the future? So this leads into the last point here. What is the role of any multilateralism, or is multilateralism to be replaced by bilateralism, or, heaven forbid, unilateralism? And is there a role to be played in soft law? How legally effective is soft law? So let's just very quickly review some fact patterns. We've all seen them, but I wanted to just contextualize it in very real terms. In terms of social and health, we know that the United States has withdrawn from the World Health Organization, impacting funding and the effectiveness of the legal effectiveness and functional effect of the WHO. There is unregulated migration from MENA to the EU, which is fracturing social cohesion and putting a huge drain on social resources. In terms of human rights and international law, Israel recently annexed the occupied territories. In terms of business, the US is threatening to withdraw from the World Trade Organization, with an impact on supply chain disruption. The OPEC and Russian pricing dispute introduces instability in global commodity supplies. Greater reliance on technology, and this forum is a great example, redirects capital flows into technology and but at the cost of an information-based intrusion into civil rights. Lastly, in terms of international law, the US has withdrawn from 3 nuclear arms treaties, impacting the safety and security, or lack thereof. So with all that in mind, my second last point is to leave you with a proposition. And the proposition is this: given the fact patterns as we've just illustrated, if the effectiveness of international organizations and multilateralism to manage transnational crises. That depends on the legal effectiveness of international obligations underlying treaty law and on the policy effect of soft law. Then, such effectiveness will depreciate if states prefer to engage transnational crises as bilateral zero-sum games vis-a-vis assuming a global responsibility and treating it as variable sum game. So we've reduced transnational crises to game theory, which is not a bad way to go. So I will leave you with some options as to how we proceed with this question. Is there a role for an expanded civil society? And if so, is there a role for government to further the education of that civil society? Do we enlist the responsibility and the accountability of non-governmental organizations vis-a-vis international organizations? Do we enfranchise the communities who have up to now been marginalized in social decision-making? And my favorite point, and that's one that will come out in my closing remarks, is should we proliferate and promulgate global administrative law? A hot topic in some circles. Second, lastly, how do we interpret international law? Is there such a thing as a rule of international law or a rule by international law? And very lastly, let's appreciate that sovereignty, which we know about. It concerns not only legal authority and political power and identity, but this crisis has also shown that it has limitations. Mr. Moderator, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. And actually, for the issues that you raised just now, especially how we can incorporate this international law. So let's pass the floor to Mr. Emmanuel Goffi for his opening remarks.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Moderator. Thank you, Andreas, for the invitation. I'm really, really proud and honored to be with you all here. And obviously, speaking after you, Mr. Howard, that will be kind of tough. What I wanted to do is definitely not to give a lecture or explain you what's going on in the world with the COVID. I just wanted to share some thoughts. As you know it, because it's been told, obviously I'm working mainly on artificial intelligence, on ethics, right? So I'm sorry, but my tropism will go to artificial intelligence and ethics. Maybe you're not really familiar with that, but I'm just trying to, share some thoughts, and you will tell me later what you think about that. I just want to start with something that you've certainly heard of. Obviously, this is all those tracking apps that are appearing here and there in lots of countries. And basically, that's really interesting because here in France, there's been a vote at the National Assembly yesterday or the day before. And we've decided that we should use this kind of apps in order to track people that would be touched by the COVID-19, right? You know how it works, so it's a Bluetooth system, etc., right? And my point is, I've been really, really shocked by that, because here in France, and I guess in many countries in Europe, we are not really keen on being, controlled or looked at by this kind of tools, right? So my question was, how can we now accept this kind of intrusive tools in our lives, while we are criticizing some countries that we label as authoritarian? Obviously, we all think about China, and we label them as authoritarian because they're using this kind of tool in order to control their population, right? And this is my perception. Maybe I'm wrong, but my perception is that these tools that are used in countries that we are criticizing all the time are slowly coming in the West. And we are accepting them without even discussing them seriously. I don't know in your own countries how it works, but here in France, there hasn't been any kind of really, democratic debate on that, right? Obviously, the Assemblée Nationale, the National Assembly, has talked about that, But when you look at the debate, you see that it's not about what is good for the country. It's much more what is good for the party, right? Which is actually holding the power, and what is good for the lobbyists that are just pushing for this kind of technology to be deployed in France, right? So it's and my concern as a French and a Canadian, because in Canada we will do the same soon, is how is that possible that we're accepting these kind of things without saying the word, right? Without we're and you know that French people, we are I mean, we are really prone to criticize and to cry over this really tough life that we have, and we are going on the street and we are always criticizing everything. And this time we have this kind of really intrusive tool that has been said that will be used in France, and everyone is quiet. So the point is, what I've discovered is that obviously what explains that not only but mainly is the fact that we are in a very uncertain situation with this pandemic. And obviously, maybe you know that, but the French president, Emmanuel Macron, has presented the situation as a war, right? And words are really important, because when you present things as wars, it legitimates all the tools that you will use in order to fight against the war. But obviously, like I know that this is not a war at all. War is just a word that is just putting some ideas and perceptions in the mind of people, and then they will accept what is supposedly needed in order to fight this war. So the COVID-19 for me is really something that has changed the perception of the French people, of the Western world, not only in France. It's the case in Switzerland, it's the case in Denmark, it's the case in Canada, it's certainly the case in the US, and in lots of other countries all around the world. And my concern with that is that there is kind of a flattening of the ethical appreciation of what is acceptable and what is not between the East and the West. We were used to criticize the East, right? That's the legacy of the Cold War. Lots of people are saying that the Cold War ended with the collapse of the Soviet Union. I do think that the Cold War is still there, right? Maybe it's a little bit less visible, but it's still there. And I think that with the COVID-19, this divide between the two sides, at least at the ethical level, has been flattened, and we are accepting things that were supposedly only done by authoritarian countries, right? And this is something that is really concerning to me. COVID-19, according to me, is really speeding up this process. We are all using, the digital tools that are available. We are doing that right now, right? So we know that we are sharing a lot of data, and we know that data is definitely the new oil. And we know that China is struggling in order to get much more data, in order to develop its own AI, in order to develop its own market. And we know that China is fighting against the US because the US is doing exactly the same, right? So with this intrusion of AI and the fact that the COVID has facilitated this intrusion of AI in our everyday life, using the internet, using social networks, using this kind of drones that are, looking at our temperature and this kind of things. I mean, somehow I feel like we are just maybe abandoning some of our values, right? And we are slowly accepting things that were not acceptable before. So my question, and I will hand on that, is what will happen after the COVID-19? Will we just at some point maybe wake up and say, oh my God, what did we accept for some really, disputable reasons? What have we done, right? Are we moving toward the society of control like in China or in other countries? And if yes, is that something that is acceptable? Is that really what we want? And I think that in the momentum, we are not thinking about that. We are not thinking about the after. And this after is, according to me, once again, because I'm really into ethics, really concerning. And I will end on that, and thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Mr. Goffi. And we will come back to what you have said during our Q&As. Mrs. Speckhard, the floor is yours.
Okay, it's a real pleasure to address you. I wish I was in Greece myself. And we sure enjoyed our time, Ambassador Speckhard and myself, and he said to say hello. And thank you for including me with AHEPA. I was very happy to see some of your AHEPA members out in front of the White House when Turkish President Erdogan came to visit. And I was happy to see Greeks present there to raise their voices. And bravo to Greece for controlling Corona so well, doing such a better job than our own country and leadership has been doing. And I hope it continues to be a success through the summer and the fall. I'm going to speak on terrorism, and as I think you mentioned earlier, I've spoken to over 700 terrorists. I'm a psychologist, and I've in-depth interviewed them all over the world. And in the past years, I've interviewed 239 ISIS terrorists, a lot of them prisoners in SDF territory and in Iraq, but some that had returned and defected back into Turkey or come back home into the Balkans and Europe. And what I'd like to say in terms of security and terrorism in the time of pandemic is that terrorists don't stop in the face of pandemic. In fact, they attempt to use it and harness it for their own ends. So while we saw in the last months, ISIS has carried out 100 attacks in Iraq, even though they've been defeated territorially, and we like to say that that's done and over with, it certainly isn't. And in 1 week, they managed to launch attacks in 7 countries: Egypt, Nigeria, Philippines, Somalia, and Yemen. That was a week in March. In Afghanistan, they launched a devastating funeral parlor attack in which 24 were killed and 68 wounded. And they also went into a maternity ward in Kabul, launching a horrific attack on pregnant women and their babies, with 16 dead. And now we watch as ISIS seems to be gaining a foothold in Libya with the help of Turkey. So how has ISIS tried to make use of COVID? We see a number of different claims, not only from ISIS, but jihadists in general. So there was an Egyptian that was proclaiming, an Islamist, proclaiming that if you get COVID, you should not stay home or go to the hospital. You should go to government centers and infect as many people as possible. And this goes with the whole idea of suicide terrorism, that you sacrifice yourself on behalf of the group and you kill others as you kill yourself. So it goes with the ideology. But we've seen that in Iraq, US-led forces were already pulling back and consolidating their bases in the face of Iranian-backed Shia militias. But when COVID came, a lot of the coalition partners departed from Iraq, and the US withdrew even further. And this leaves a foothold for ISIS. As I told you, they just did 100 attacks in Iraq. In Syria, we already had a pullback last fall, which I'll get to in a second. But COVID makes it very hard for the military to act. And of course, our diplomats, our people doing foreign policy, are distracted by all the issues that are coming up with COVID. So terrorist groups like ISIS are saying things like the spokesman just gave a talk 2 days ago, which was released as an audio talk, and he likened the COVID crisis to the biblical story of Moses cursing Pharaoh with the plagues until he let his people go. And al-Qurashi from ISIS claimed that coronavirus is a modern day plague sent by Allah to inflict the US and its allies and to demonstrate the righteousness of Muslims and Allah's divine power. And to turn us to repent and to become Muslims. And he claimed that the deaths from the COVID crisis, which we just reached the 100,000 mark in the US, is similar to the deaths, civilian deaths, in ISIS-held territories in Syria and Iraq. So we were getting our punishment from God. So you can imagine that that message resonates with many. Not only that, many preachers who didn't necessarily have anything to do with terrorism were preaching that the COVID crisis would not infect the true believers. So we saw Iran, which had a huge outbreak. During their holy days, many Iranians traveled to Iraq to go to holy shrines, and they traveled believing that they couldn't be infected, They gathered together in very close quarters, and they kissed holy relics one after another. So bringing COVID to spread all through Iraq, which Iraq now has a bad problem, and infecting one another. So the terrorists have also said we should use chaos and distraction caused by the pandemic to break ISIS members out of prison in Iraq and Syria. This is a long-held objective. Al-Baghdadi was urging his followers to do this before he was killed. And this echoes back to Al-Qaeda in Iraq, where in 2012, they launched a campaign called Breaking the Walls. And they broke prisoners, mostly people that were experienced jihadists, 500 of them out of Iraqi prisons. And now ISIS would like them to do the same with the prisons in Syria. So this comes to the issue of the Syrian Democratic Forces in northeast Syria, who were our strongest ally in fighting ISIS. Turkey claims that they were, but in fact it was the SDF that defeated ISIS in Raqqa and that now holds 10,000 prisoners. This was with the help of the coalition, with our air power, but they were on the ground fighting and they took the most hits, the most loss of lives. And they now hold 10,000 prisoners. Last fall, President Trump gave the green light for Turkey to invade in North Syria on the pretense that that our allies are actually terrorists themselves. So Turkey's claiming that the SDF is PKK and that they've been launching attacks from North Syria into Turkey. Our military tells me there's no evidence of that. And we do know that the PKK is active in Turkey and north of Iraq, and that there are attacks inside of Turkey, but there was no evidence that the SDF was launching them themselves. So we have to look at this whole thing of Turkey, who is themselves struggling with COVID right now. In the past, they gave multi-level and long-term support for ISIS. They allowed 45,000 foreign fighters to stream across their borders. They've now organized rebel fighters to fight against the SDF. They've overtaken towns like Afrin. They're causing them to be have ethnic cleansing and to speak Turkish. You see the Turkish flag flying. And we see Turkey and Turkish-backed rebels bombarding the prisons last fall, in which 200 ISIS escapes occurred. So are we going to see more of this? Are these prisoners going to all escape? And what about the 2,000 that came from Western countries? Do our countries need to take them back as a security issue? And if we take them back, can they be rehabilitated is a big issue? And not if we don't have good programs in place. We also see the issues of Turkey moving into Libya, and this is of particular concern for Greece with the agreement about maritime rights and who is being shipped into Libya. These are Syrian former rebels, and one of them was just caught and revealed to be a high-level ISIS operative. So are we seeing Turkey continuing to spread or to allow the spread of ISIS militancy and terrorism? And I think I will stop there because I don't want to take too long, but I'm happy to answer questions.
Thank you, Will, Mrs. Speckhard. Thank you very much. Now we may pass the floor to Mr. Lupan.
Thank you very much. I hope you hear me well. I'd like to touch on a number of issues that we have already discussed here, but my focus will be on the one aspect of the international relations and particularly related to energy. Oil and gas interests in the MENA region, why MENA region is so much of a focus aside from the obvious problem of terrorism that is present in MENA region. From my perspective, the pandemic may have paused the previous international situation or maybe modified it, but we are returning to a business as usual model of realism in international relations, and it's based on filling the vacuum of power by state actors and non-state actors such as ISIS and Taliban in Afghanistan. I will particularly focus on the Russian interest in the MENA region from this perspective, as well as some of the US and EU prospective responses, what we can expect them to do. Russia has lesser resources than United States or the European Union, and obviously has a different approach to this region. As we have seen with the involvement of Russian involvement in Syria, and with the recent transfer of Russian MiG-29 fighter jets to Libya via Iran and then Syria, Russia is definitely interested in the MENA region. There are several reasons for the involvement in this region, ranging from the observation that the Kremlin does not invest significantly in countries' internal development, Russian internal development, but does so in external adventures that might create a replacement for the lack of internal success. Russian economy is not the best. It's the size of Italy. There is no internal economic success. The current administration is providing foreign success or success outside as a replacement for the public. This is one of the elements that we can see that is influencing Russian politics internally, and therefore it has an external application. It's not the most important, but it is there. It's an important element. Another element why Russia has been focused on the MENA region. The national security strategy of the year 2000 of the Russian Federation specifically states that its area of interest is Europe, Caucasus, Central Asia, Asia Pacific, and MENA. MENA is the only region Russia does not border. But of course, the strategy comes after 9/11 attack and the development of the situation in terms of the war against terrorism. We can understand that. However, terrorism is not the only reason why Russia is interested in MENA specifically, as I've already mentioned. One of its reasons is behind the role Kremlin sees for itself in the world. President Putin declared in an interview a few years ago that the dissolution of the USSR was a mistake. He was also set to restore Russia's influence in the ex-USSR area from the moment he had direct access to power, when President Yeltsin resigned in the favor of Mr. Putin. Mr. Putin was not initially elected. He was put in place by the previous president. And then, from the position of the acting head of state, he was elected as the de facto head of state, or de jure rather. The restoration of this Russian influence in the former USSR resulted in the limited invasion by Moscow of Georgia, the invasion and takeover of Crimea, and the so-called separatism in eastern Ukraine with Russian private contractors and troops on the ground. The same contractors were then used in Syria and Libya. We're talking about primarily Wagner group that attempted to attack a US position guarding an oil field in Syria, as well as the Wagner group that has been involved in Libya itself, the Libya program. Kremlin's desire to be recognized as a global power is reflected in the Russian state-subordinated academia that calls the current international system of international relations as prefabricated world order. Which begs the question of what they see as a natural world order, or how do they reconcile the fact that they obviously profess realism in international relations, and realism suggests that the international society is an anarchical one, which means the vacuum is filled by those who can fill it. So there is no such thing as prefabricated world order, and they contradict themselves on that matter. That also, in this dynamic interaction is what we can actually see in the MENA region. The sanctions that follow the invasion of the countries that are neighboring Russia. Complicated President Putin's domestic situation, economically speaking, but also his plans for putting Russia in control of the former USSR and then influencing other countries. To counter its strained economic relationship with Europe, where Russia sells most of its gas and oil, Kremlin needs these sanctions lifted. European Union dependency on Russian energy exports is approximately 39% in gas and about 30% in oil, 39 in gas and 30 in oil. An increased dependency of the European Union upon Russian resources would also increase Kremlin's say in European affairs, especially decisions towards Moscow. This is one of the reasons Russia wants to play, among other actions, a longer game in the increasing its share in European gas and oil markets, and preferably divide Europeans over the benefits of cooperating with Kremlin. Creating a sense of competition in Europe helps pitting countries against each other. The construction of the Nord Stream 2 gas line to primarily Germany, a pipeline that does not justify its cost compared to existing ones, to existing pipelines, is a clear sign of such an approach. As well as Mr. Macron's, President Macron's overtures towards Russia. I would note that around 2004, the Europeans attempted to play with an idea of an alternative pipeline that would bring gas from Central Asia to Europe, the so-called Nabucco line, via Georgia and Turkey, to increase its energy independence. The idea successfully died due to the division between potential pipeline member states, including due to Moscow involvement, though not only because of that. So the takeover of Crimea and eastern Ukraine successfully hampered plans for alternatives pipeline via Black Sea and Ukraine. Nabucco was dead. Iran, Algeria, Kuwait, and Libya remain major potential exporters of oil and gas from the nearest to the European Union areas. US did not want to continue its involvement in Syria, which is an important transit country and an important regional actor. So this responsibility, as much as this can be debated, actually fell on Turkey. In terms of Syria and Iran, as well as Iraq, Crimea became a de facto air carrier to operate in that area. Turkey continues to control the Bosporus, a barrier for the Kremlin plans to use the strait, the Bosporus Strait, for faster access to the Mediterranean. Syria, however, allows Kremlin to have a military seaport. But one more important element was clearly expressed by retired General Ivashov, who is a former Russian military commander and the person in touch with Alexander Dugin, who influenced, at least for a while, the Russian President Putin. Mr. Putin apparently gave Mr. Dugin's book to his own staff in the president's office. So General Ivashov stated very clearly and openly, Russia is fighting in Syria so that Gazprom, the Russian gas company, can sell gas to Europe, which ensures the survival of the Russian economy. They are blocking the routes for the export of the Kuwaiti, Qatari gas to Europe, or they're complicating these routes in order to remain the main supplier to Europe and increase its own delivery to Europe. That is one of the elements of the Russian interest in the MENA region. In this respect, we should know that the Russian plans clash with the Saudi opposition to Iran's role in Syria for its own reasons, and this led to the subsequent problems with the oil extraction and OPEC to keep the Russian war and sanctions spending high and oil, gas income low. As we can see, Saudi Arabia basically does not agree with Russia on most of the oil-related problems, and this is related to the Syria situation primarily. Consequently, Turkey had an important role, and we observe an increasing role in the region as an oil and gas transit country on one hand, and on the other hand as a player in this respect. Turkey's contract with the Libyan GNA government on oil extraction is a proof of diverging interests there. I doubt that it generated Russian response, the sending of the aircraft, but it certainly clashes with the Russian interests there. Libya being another possibility for the oil and gas exports to the European Union. Therefore, what we should primarily expect is that Russia and Turkey will clash interests again, but not too extensively. The difference in power is substantial, but the interest will continue to diverge. Sometimes they will agree, sometimes they will not. United States has already withdrew basically from Syria. Although it requested involvement in distribution of oil and the work on the oil fields, it will not most probably be invited to participate. US also signaled that it follows the events in the area, so they're not completely out. They're signaling their interest, at least in the area, but not a heavy involvement, not anymore. They are leaving that to others. They are leaving the others to fill the void. For now, the most important element for US involvement in that region became a secondary matter compared to the US elections. US elections are more important. They will possibly generate the lack of or a weak United States response to what is happening in the MENA region. European Union remains an important actor that, despite its slow traditional response, can influence the situation, but has an easy relationship with both Turkey and Russia. So the response of the member states will follow the lowest common denominator. It will not be very strong. We should probably see continued calls for ceasefire, UN attempts to mediate, but the situation will be dependent on regional actors, at least till the US has its elections, and maybe even after that. I would stop here. Probably took over more than my 5 minutes, and I'll hope